Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jing. I'm the co-founder and managing director of the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society. Our mission here at the Asia Society is to navigate our shared futures. So I'm very glad to welcome you all this morning, where we're going to navigate together the changing geopolitics of China and Russia in the Arctic together. CCA, the Center for China Analysis, is a China and Russia program led by our senior fellow, Lyle Morris, here in the room, is very pleased to co-host with Norwegian Consulate in New York City to discuss the evolving dynamics of cooperation and competition between China and Russia in the Arctic. Our discussion will feature leading minds and first-class experts from both Norway and the United States to discuss about this very timely topic, which needs more attention, to be very honest, and to discuss about the broader implication for Norway, Europe, and the United States. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Norwegian Consulate for hosting this event. In particular, I'd like to thank the State Secretary, Eivind Vad Petersson, and the Consul General Heidi Olofsson for attending this morning. This event won't be possible without your generous and constant support. And I do hope this is the beginning for a very fruitful collaboration for years to come. One of my old professors from Kennedy School, Joseph Nye, coined a less known but I think equally important trap. It's called Kinderberg trap, which as I understand is that in the great power competition, global public goods supply becomes insufficient. And one of them, I think, is a more accurate understanding of the China-Russia competition and collaboration in the Arctic. So today, I think it's up to us. On the one hand, the concerned regional power, Norway. On the other hand, the non-state actors such as a think tank in New York, the Center for China Analysis, to step up to fill that gap for the benefits of all. There are, as I understand from last night, around 5 million Americans with Norwegian heritage. So I would say that Norway has a very sizable impact here, including on some politically influential figure, including the Secretary of Defense, who I understand from Fox News is very proud to announce he has 96.8% of Norwegian heritage. And I'm sure the State Secretary will correct me if I'm wrong later. So I'm very glad to say that Norway is taking a leadership role here to shed light on a very important topic for the American audience. To right-size this very important issue. On the other hand, CCA was funded on the belief that it is consequential to get China right, to right-size China's challenge. And in order to do that, we have to see it from the perspective of Beijing. That's why our mission, China from Inside Out, remains our North Star for more than 50 fellows from the center around the world to help key stakeholders to understand the real China from its own perspective, to help decision makers around the world to avoid mirror imaging, and policymakers in particular to reduce the risk of misinformation, misunderstanding, miscalculation, and eventually to reduce the likelihood of policy failure. Which brings me to the topic of this morning's discussion, which is increasingly timely given President Trump's particular interest in Greenland and the overall region, and that's China and Russia in the Arctic. It is safer to see that while the interest in China and Russia is high, but Arctic has not received attention it deserves. And as I learned from our first-class expert last night, there's quite a bit of misperceptions and misunderstandings about China's influence in Arctic already in DC and beyond. I think that's why our discussion today is particularly important. China and Russia, to be fair, has strategic and economic interest in the Arctic. They are collaborating more than ever, and the strategic importance of the Arctic region is increasing, both due to the ice melting more rapidly due to the climate change, and because the geopolitical shift is more rapidly due to the Trump 2.0's paradigm shifting. So how does China and Russia's growing interest in both economic, environment, and scientific dimensions in the Arctic is going to impact Europe, US, China, and beyond is what we're going to discuss today with our first class panel. But before that, let me first and foremost turn to our guest of honor today, a very important voice in Europe, the State Secretary of Norway, also Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Eivind Vad Petersson, to give us some very important opening remarks. I have to say that the Secretary Petersson have given me some best introductions of Norway's strategic positioning last night. You're all in for a very good treat. So the floor is yours. Welcome to Asia Society for the first time. Secretary, please.
Thank you so much, and a very good morning to you all. Let me just be very clear, although I consider myself very Norwegian, the Secretary of Defense, his percentage is a lot higher than mine. Thank you very much to the Asia Society for hosting us, and thank you to every single one in the room for showing an interest in the Arctic. While we live in interesting times, interest in the Arctic is certainly increasing as well. Just one example is the airport in Tromsø, the Arctic capital of the world. The airport was recently massively expanded, and nonetheless it's already reached its maximum capacity. This is an airport that I remember vividly from my childhood, and I remember it as a massive metropolis. It had more than one gate. It was huge. And that had to do with the simple fact that I spent my childhood growing up even further north and east than Tromsø, in Kirkenes, a small border town, and was then back in the 1980s the only land border in the entire world between the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia, and NATO. My childhood town, we checked 6.5 kilometers from that border. It's an important fact for us Norwegians that out of our population of roughly 5.5 million, roughly 10% of us live and work above the Arctic Circle. It's not something extraordinary, exotic. It's an ordinary part of Norwegian daily life. And my upbringing up there was not especially exotic. Yes, during winter it was somewhat dark, and during the summer months it was midnight sun. But it was a normal Norwegian upbringing. And looking at the globe, I since come to realize that I grew up as far north as the northern coast of Alaska. And I had the pleasure to visit the northern coast of Alaska last year. And that is certainly a very, very different place. We visited the northern coast of Alaska in April, and there was still massive sea ice. All along the northern coasts of Norway, our harbors are ice-free year-round. And that has something to do with another recent controversy. There's some warm water coming out of a gulf somewhat south of us. We just refer to the Gulf Stream. I think we can still call it the Gulf Stream. That keeps our waters ice-free. But the increased interest in the Arctic is also connected to what's happening to ice, because the ice is literally melting. The planet is warming, and the warming is happening by far by the fastest pace in our part of the world. So the ice is indeed literally melting, opening up sea routes, and it's just a matter of time until it will be possible to sail with large ships straight across the Arctic Ocean. With, of course, massive consequences for maritime logistics, shortening significantly the transport time between Europe and Southeast Asia. There's a saying back home in Norway when it comes to the Chinese interest that of all the things that President Xi thinks about when he wakes up in the morning, the Arctic is not on top of his list. But we feel somewhat certain that it's moving up the ladder. And it has, of course, something to do with the changing geographics of the region, with sea routes opening up, with all that entails. And it has, of course, something to do with the changing geopolitics. For us, this is home, and this is our most important strategic region. And we are fortunate in the fact that there are that we can say that we believe to call the Arctic, to use terms as there's a race for resources or even a competition for control, luckily makes not really any sense at all. The Arctic is mostly an ocean. Yes, there's ice on top of it, as I just said, the ice is melting. It's not resembling the Antarctic, where there's actually a massive continent with a completely different framework. So there's no need for an Arctic treaty, because there is actually a treaty governing this space, and that's the law of the sea, which provides a very useful governance structure. There's no really any remaining disputes in terms of control. There might be some minor tension between Canada and the US in their side of the Arctic. From the Norwegian side, we were fortunate enough to manage to settle our only remaining border dispute in the Barents Sea with Russia 15 years ago, having negotiated for about 40 years. So in terms of control, things are settled, which has implications as well, of course, that yes, there's raising interest in making use of all the resources in the Arctic, also literally opening up as the ice is melting. But we believe it's, fortunately, not an accurate term to speak of a race for resources or a race for control. Things are settled, no really disputes. But all these things you will hear and learn more about from the excellent experts lined up here today. From my side, once again, thank you to the Asian Society for hosting us, and thank you all for showing interest in the Arctic as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for opening us to a wonderful discussion to follow. Now I'd like to welcome our senior fellow, Lyle Morris, to get to the panel, and all our first-class panelists to give us a wonderful and thought-provoking discussion to have. Lyle, I think I will turn this over to you now.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll have some discussion afterwards.
Yes.
With the audience.
Would you want to stay? Good morning. Thanks for joining me this morning. My name is Lyle Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis at the Asia Society Policy Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to a discussion on evolving dynamics of cooperation and competition between China and Russia in the Arctic. This event will feature leading academics from Norway and the United States to assess China's engagement in the Arctic, including its ongoing collaboration with Russia, and explore its broader implications for Norway, Europe, and the United States. I want to thank co-sponsor, the Norwegian Consulate in New York, for supporting this important and timely discussion, so thank you. Let me introduce our panel. First, Jo Inge Bekkevold is a senior China fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies and the Norwegian Defence University College. Before he entered academia, Jo Inge had a distinguished career in the Norwegian Foreign Service, with posts in Hanoi from 2001 to 2005 and Beijing from 2005 to 2011. Jo Inge is the coordinator of the international workshop series International Order at Sea and took part in Asia Arctic, a project on Asian countries' interests and policies in the Arctic, funded by the Norwegian Research Council. He is currently working on research projects on Chinese geopolitics and China's relations with Russia and India. Next is Katarzyna Zysk, Professor of International Relations and Contemporary History at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies. At IFS, Katarzyna also served as Deputy Director, Head of Center for Security Policy, Director of Research and Acting Dean of the Defence University College. She was also visiting professor at Stanford University, University of Oxford, U.S. Naval War College, and Sciences Po in Paris. Her research focuses on international security, defense, and strategic studies, with a special focus on Russia's military, nuclear deterrence, security in the Arctic, as well as AI and emerging technologies in defense innovation. And finally, Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick, a senior research scientist in China in the Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at the Center for Naval Analysis. She's also a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. Liz is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Sino-Russian relations, Northeast Asian and Central Asian security, and Arctic geopolitics. In 2023 to 24, she was a fellow at the East-West Center, where she directed a project on U.S. Indo-Pacific partners and the Arctic. And in October 23, she participated in a State Department speaker program in Iceland to discuss Russian and Chinese interests in the Arctic. Liz is currently working on a book, completing a book called China's Risk, Energy, Water, Food, and Regional Security, which will be published next year by Columbia University Press. So thank you all three for joining me this morning, and welcome. Let me just kick things off for some context as to why we're holding a panel on Russia and China in the Arctic. First, I think the strategic importance of the Arctic is increasing as the Arctic sea ice melts more rapidly than expected due to climate change. New Arctic shipping routes and economic opportunities in resource extraction will open in the coming years. Shipping routes through the Northern Sea Route, for example, is expected to offer a more cost-effective alternative to the Suez Canal. Furthermore, the Arctic holds abundant natural resources, including oil, gas, minerals, and fish. Its untapped oil and gas reserves, for example, are estimated to comprise about 25% of the world's undiscovered resources. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that Chinese strategic calculations concerning the Arctic have grown steadily during the last decade. China, as a self-proclaimed near-Arctic state, is a somewhat newcomer to the Arctic, but has shown growing interest in the economic, environmental, and scientific dimensions of the region. It's safe to say that Chinese leaders see the region as a new crossroads of the world, a new source of raw materials and new avenues for manifesting its growing power. Russia, on the other hand, is more of an established Arctic power. It is one of 8 members of the Arctic Council. It has extensive sea bottom claims in the Arctic. Approximately 1/5 of Russia's landmass is north of the Arctic Circle. Russia is one of 5 littoral states bordering the Arctic Ocean. And furthermore, out of roughly 4 million inhabitants of the Arctic, roughly half live in Arctic Russia, making it the largest Arctic country by population. The stated goals of Russia in its Arctic policy are to utilize its natural resources, protect its ecosystems, use the seas for new transportation routes, and ensure it remains a, quote, zone of peace and cooperation, which we will get to later in the discussion about whether that is still holding. So this brings us to the topic of today's panel, which is what are China's and Russia's interests in the Arctic? We know, for example, that the two nations are cooperating more, especially in scientific and maritime exploration. So what interests bring these two nations together in the Arctic? So that's where I'll start with the question to the panel today. So Jo Inge, let me start with you. So my question is, what brings Russia and China together in the Arctic? And do you think their strategic interests will endure? I'll start with you, Jo Inge, and then Katarzyna and Liz.
Thank you, Lyle. First of all, let me sort of thank the Asia Society and the Norwegian Consulate for hosting this event and inviting me. I'm first and foremost a China scholar, so to visit the Asia Society is always it's always of interest when you have a background in China and Asia studies. But being a Norwegian, of course, China in the Arctic is one of the topics we are working on. So let me answer your question like this. I mean, there is a map out there of the Arctic. I don't know how easy it is for you to see, but you you will not find China on that map because China is not an Arctic nation. And that also, of course, influences China's policies and also ability to influence and project power into the region. China, no doubt China is the pacing challenge for the United States. So there is a superpower rivalry between US and China, but the sort of the core geographic region of that is in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. So if you compare to the Cold War between the US and Soviet, the Arctic was geographically located in the center of that superpower rivalry. It's a little bit different today because the geographic center of US-China rivalry is in the Indo-Pacific. So the Arctic is more in the periphery of that rivalry than what was the case during the Cold War. So that already kind of limits a little bit sort of the potential for conflict in the region. But China definitely has interests. I think you already mentioned some of them. It's access to natural resources. And I would say mainly that's possible through collaboration with Russia, less so potentially with the other Arctic nations since they're all NATO members. Secondly, there is an interest in Beijing for shipping, but I think we will come back to that a little bit later as well, more in detail. There are also some limitations to the potential of the Northern Sea Road, but certainly there is an interest on the Chinese sides. With regard to military, I think it's important to distinguish between sort of the American part of the Arctic, located, then I'm talking about Alaska, Bering Strait area, because that's a very important flank in the Indo-Pacific rivalry between China and the US. On the European side, which is, there's about, I don't know how much does it in miles, but it's about 4,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait to the Norwegian part of the Arctic. So it's quite some distance. So for China to be able to project military power into that region would be more difficult, but certainly space awareness is of great interest to China. So I think on all those aspects, I think there is a potential for collaboration between China and Russia. Russia is interested in Chinese investments. But when it comes to the military side of it, I think it will be more concerns, reservations on the Russian side for Chinese military presence in the European part of the Arctic. And that, if we see a development in that direction, I'm not quite sure that Moscow would be too happy about that, actually.
Thank you. Katarzyna?
Well, I think that Russia and China share a number of mutually beneficial interests in the Arctic. Jo Inge has mentioned them, but seen from the Russian perspective, China is very important to fulfilling or pursuing Russian economic ambitions in the region. They were clearly formulated already back in 2008 when Russia said they want to develop the Arctic as the foremost base for natural resources. It was supposed to happen by 2020, but Russian foreign policy stand in the way. Of course, sanctions have limited that development severely. But it's still the case, and of course China is very important to that objective. So as Jo Inge has mentioned, both countries, they have an interest and actually cooperation on exploiting the LNG projects on Novatek on the Russian side on the Yamal Peninsula, which is probably the biggest aspect of that cooperation in the Arctic as of today. And there is also the Northern Sea Route. It is of interest to China. China has actually been the biggest user of the Northern Sea Route over more than a decade. Again, sanctions have made that much more difficult, but China still shows an interest. So we've seen that the Russian objective is to develop the Northern Sea Route, which is going, along the from east along this Arctic Siberian coast to the west. The objective to Russia is to develop this major maritime link connecting continents. And again, China is very important to reaching that objective. Scientific cooperation is very important as well. And China has an established scientific presence in the European Arctic as well, including on the Norwegian Svalbard archipelago. So this is But I think to understand correctly the Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Arctic, we also have to look at the broader relationship. And we've seen how, for instance, the Russian need for Chinese support during the war, during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has led to closing or increasing that cooperation also in the Arctic. How Russia has been willing to put the Arctic card on the table to get more support from China elsewhere. So this is also an aspect that we have to take into account. But overall, just last thing I will mention at this moment is that this actually has been a very long-standing objective of Russia. In 2013, they announced a pivot to Asia. And a major objective of that has been namely to develop strategic relationship with China. And again, the geopolitical developments, annexation of Crimea, and then the full-scale invasion has actually led these two actors together. And we've seen the spillover of that relationship also playing out in the Arctic.
Thank you. Liz?
I'd also like to thank the Asia Society and the Norwegian Consulate for this opportunity to discuss an often neglected topic and to take a different view of China-Russia relations from the High North. And I want to point out these are my personal views, not those of CNA or its sponsors. So can we see the other map? Yes. So this is a Chinese view of the Arctic, and I'll get to that in a moment. So one thing that's very interesting about China-Russia relations in the Arctic is that it's the only region where China cannot act independently, and it relies on Russia for access through the Northern Sea Route, which is the waterway above the Russian Arctic coast. And it's true that the Arctic has given a boost to their economic ties, to their energy relationship, although as Katarzyna mentioned, sanctions have complicated this in many ways. But Russia has kept China to the peripheries of the Arctic and has not allowed China to develop bases on its coastline or to act in any major way in developing infrastructure on the Russian Arctic coast, which is very important to the Russian economy and to the identity of Russia as an Arctic state. And this has been problematic for the US because it's pushed China to the North Pacific Arctic, which is closer to the Alaska coast. So we've seen more exercises between Russia and China happening in that area, as well as on the other side, closer to my Norwegian friends. So Russia's kept this space above its territory for its own particular uses and to demonstrate its sovereignty, although it does need other partners like China to participate. I don't think, so this map here, let me explain this map. So this is a map from a Chinese research institute. It was published about 2012. And what's interesting is that China is in the middle of the two poles. So when you look at the map of the Arctic, normally you look from the top, and China's missing. But China wants to make the point that it is central to the development of polar affairs, both Arctic and Antarctic. And this is a cover of Anne-Marie Brady's book on China's a polar great power, because this is the idea that the Chinese leadership is trying to promote under Xi Jinping, that this should not be a space where China doesn't operate. So we're going to discuss what that means. But just to make some general comments about the China-Russia partnership, I don't think that they coordinate closely in the Arctic, although their relationship has expanded considerably, as we will discuss. They have different visions. So China has this idea that the Arctic is a common space for humanity, but Russia, like the US, believes that the Arctic is for Arctic states and welcomes cooperation by others to the extent that that is recognized. And Russia actually was one of the opponents to China's becoming an observer state in the Arctic Council initially because of this reason. so I think they do have various differences, China and Russia, but they have made a political decision to prioritize their partnership. And this is because Xi and Putin share certain domestic political goals to maintain their authoritarian rule for as long as possible. And they also face similar geopolitical pressures. And for China, this means that if the border issue with Russia, which had been an issue for many centuries, is stable, then China can focus on being a maritime great power, including in the Arctic region. So the China-Russia partnership, as it has been solidified of late, is important for geopolitics and also for the Arctic.
Thank you. Liz, let me continue with you on this next question. So as you know, China operates several research stations in the Arctic. They just added 2 icebreakers to their fleet, which are capable of clearing paths for merchant ships in the northern latitudes, in particular, as was mentioned previously, the Northern Sea Route. So on the Northern Sea Route, what is your take and perception on how important that is for China's strategic interests, in particular with the Arctic?
Well, for one thing, they don't talk about the Northern Sea Route. They talk about the Polar Silk Road. and so they see Russia as a transit space from northeast China to the European Arctic. And that's an issue between China and Russia, because for Russia, they have the longest Arctic coastline, and they want that to be recognized. They don't want to be a little component in a Chinese polar plan. So that's a difference between the two right there. And the Polar Silk Road is important for the development of northeast China. So northeastern China was the first to industrialize in the 1950s and has lagged behind the southern coastal areas. And so for China, participation in Arctic trade and investment is a way to engage these somewhat lagging areas of China. And they've seen investment in energy as important to its energy security. So the LNG that can be potentially derived from the Russian Arctic would help alleviate some concerns about shipping through the Persian Gulf, for example, and so on.
Katarzyna and Jo Inge, same question to you about the Northern Sea.
Right. So yeah, I agree with what Elizabeth says. I think that China sees a potential. I mean, in the Northern Sea Route is a possibility because we've seen that the Chinese shipping companies, so like COSCO, was a regular visitor at the Northern Sea Route over the past years. At some years, they actually sent dozen ships into the route. Again, as I mentioned, this has been limited by the sanctions. However, there is a plan between these two actors to actually build ice-strengthened ships to explore further that route. It is shorter. If we look from northern China, we talk about distance savings about 28% from northern China to northern Europe. So there is a possibility. There are lots of limitations. We can talk about what limits the potential of this route. But yeah, I think there is definitely a potential. The problem with the route, and I agree, is that Russia views the Northern Sea Route as a national sea route under Russian right national jurisdiction, which is disputed. Especially there are 4 straits along this route, which other countries such as the United States disputes. They say these are international straits, while to Russia these are territorial waters. And so Russia definitely wants to have control over that route. They are concerned about the access of foreign actors, and this has been most recently illustrated by Putin, who signed a new law, I believe it was December 2022, again restricting access of foreign warships and state, also governmental vessels, which could be scientific, which to Russia will often means intelligence gathering, to increase control of that route. And I think the primary objective of that new law was first and foremost the United States, NATO. There has been a lot of discussion about freedom of navigation operation in the northern waters. However, I also wonder whether this could be addressed potentially also to China. Because as it's been already mentioned, yes, there is potential definitely in this relationship, there are real interests, but there is still lingering suspicion between these two countries. And I think especially when we look at from Moscow, is the defense and security establishment. For years and years, up to annexation of Crimea, we could hear and we could read about China being a potential security threat. And if you look at the Russian modernization program that was set in motion in 2008, it also had China as an object as a potential threat. And exercises such as Vostok, large-scale exercises in 2008, 2010, 13, and 14, they had scenarios that indicated that China was a potential adversary. This, of course, has changed. We will not find any references to China in Russian official documents or statements as a potential security problem, but this has not gone. This has not just disappeared. It's just a political decision not to highlight that. But so I think one illustrative example of how Russia thinks is that the concern about the multi-million army growing just behind the border, about the economic and military potential that surpasses Russian in many ways, is a problem, and that especially conventional disparity, and that the huge arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons that Russia has is also being kept with China in mind. And former commander of the Siberian military district, General Chirkin, said that Russia has to keep that nuclear arsenal and non-strategic nuclear weapons to be able to, how he put it like to quiet down an unruly friend with a conventional nuclear club if necessary, because he thinks that friendship is possible only between strong nations, which is a very, I would say, Russian definition of friendship. But I think it's still the case, and again, we cannot look at the Russian Chinese relationship in the Arctic without considering that broader context, because this is still, I think the suspicion is still there, and it affects certainly other areas of cooperation, and the sovereignty and control of Northern Sea Route is very important.
Thank you. Jo Inge?
Thanks, Lyle. Yeah, so the question is, what is the potential for the Northern Sea Route as a commercial link between China, Asia, and Europe in terms of trade, right? Let me pose two questions to the audience. Do you know how many vessels transit the Malacca Strait each year? I have the figures for 2023. Any ideas? The Malacca Strait, what is the figure for 2023? 90,000. 90,000. Do you have, what would be your guess about the Northern Sea Route? What is the number of vessels transiting the Northern Sea Route in 2023? Then I'm meaning the full length of the Northern Sea Route from Asia to Europe. 200? 75. I'm not saying 75,000, I'm saying 75, less than 100. So, of course, the number of ships sailing between Russian ports and Asia, that is much higher, because there is a lot of trade and shipment between Russian ports and Chinese and Asian ports. So that figure would be higher. But transiting the whole length of the Northern Sea Route, so still less than 100 a year. So then the question is, how much potential is there? And I totally agree, there is a potential, there is an interest, but in my view, a couple of things are important to keep in mind that will kind of limit a little bit the potential. And one is, Katarzyna already mentioned it, if you sail from Japan, South Korea, and northern parts of China to Northern Europe, that is shorter than to sail through the Indian Ocean. But from Shanghai, if you sail from Shanghai, it's more or less the same distance if you sail through the Northern Sea Route to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. That is similar to sailing from Shanghai through the Indian Ocean and through the Suez to southern Europe. That's the same distance. And where are most of China's export originated? Well, from ports south of Shanghai. So the largest part of China's export, it would still be shorter to sail through the Indian Ocean. And then in addition to that, you need to add uncertainties about the ice conditions, very high insurance, there are no third markets along in the Arctic Ocean, because many vessels, they usually stop in at least 1 or 2, 3 more ports along the way. So there are no third markets in the Arctic. And then also, so that's the commercial value of it. So certainly I think it will increase, but there will be limits to it. And then there is another related discussion is, what if the Suez is closed? Right? Would the Northern Sea Route be an important alternative? Yes, potentially. If the Suez is closed for long term, it could be. But if the Suez is closed, or the Malacca Strait is closed due to a dispute between the United States and China, then the Northern Sea Route is actually not an alternative, because you would still need to sail through the Bering Strait. So again, that would limit its potential. So yes, I think we will see an increase in sailing, but we should not sort of exaggerate the potential of it.
May I just add one thing? So I agree, there is a lot of limitations. I mean, this has been discussed for years and years now, the potential of the Northern Sea Route. The thing is, many companies, they still test it because of that potential. I mean, they tested it until, of course, the sanctions were imposed. And the limitation is, as you know, the insurance premiums are high. Some of the waters along the Northern Sea Route are shallow, so it limits how much cargo you can take. And of course, especially when we talk about cargo shipping, it's on-time delivery. And the problem with the Northern Sea Route is sometimes it can be unpredictable. Even if it will be open during summer, you still have floating ice, which can block some of the shallow straits. So you need icebreaker assistance mostly. You will need that, which means also high icebreaker fees, because that's where Russia wants to gain their money. But that being said, again, there is still, I'm not sure if comparison with Suez or Malacca is actually useful, because I don't think, apart from some propaganda in Russia, there's nobody really expect that this will challenge these two channels. But still, in some deliveries, you know, between ports in northern Asia, and northern Europe, it still can save 10 to 15 days potentially. It's a lot of fuel. It's a lot of money. So these companies, if the sanctions will be lifted, they will be testing it. But just one last thing I would like to, which is relevant for the Russian-Chinese relationship in the region. Yes, China is interested in exploring this potential. However, what is interesting is that there are other routes. So you have one, of course, the Northern Sea Route along Russia. Then there is the Canadian, you know, the Northwest Passage. But there is also the Transpolar route. It's not really viable today, but with opening of the Arctic Ocean, if these changes continues, with improvement in technology, you can imagine that this route could be also used by, for instance, by China, and then the relationship will be weakened. China would not be as dependent on Russia in the future. This is a space to observe.
Thank you. Katarzyna, let me continue with you on this question about kind of drilling down on Russia's role in the Arctic. You know, arguably all of China's activities in the Arctic are possible only thanks to Moscow's facilitation, as you mentioned. We talked about shipping routes along Russia's Arctic coast could soon become a reality. There's this joint venture between Russia's Rosatom and China's Hainan Yangpu Xinjiang Shipping Company set to construct the necessary infrastructure, polar-class container ships to operate these Arctic routes year-round. So this development, I think, is likely to increase, it seems, Russian economic dependence on China. But President Putin, as you mentioned about Ukraine, has few options available to break out of international isolation and secure external support while he continues the war in Ukraine. So my question is, how do you see Russia's role evolving when it comes to Russia-China cooperation in the Arctic? And in particular, do you think Russia will continue to expand collaboration with China given the geopolitical kind of context of the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen over the past, especially the past 3 years, is that Russia can put their pride aside and be very pragmatic if they have to be. And we've seen that the examples of that. We talk about the Russian sensitivity about the Northern Sea route, and yet these two countries, Putin put the Arctic card on the table when Xi Jinping was visiting Russia. He started talking about joint management of the Northern Sea route. To me, that's really a big change seen, from the Russian perspective. We do not know really what will be the content of that, but I think that shows the willingness, how far Russia is willing to go, because they need Chinese support right now somewhere else, which means all the support to basically keep the Russian economy, war economy, afloat, so Russia can also keep the war continue in Ukraine. Another example was the memorandum of understanding that the Chinese Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard FSB signed in 2023 on jurisdiction in the Arctic, cooperation on that, also in the Arctic. So this potentially opens for cooperation, like maybe in combating smuggling, illegal fishing, maybe even borders. It's a potential. We do not know again what will be the actual content. We have to wait and see whether there will be filled with something real. But again, this shows that Russia is willing to go quite far. But still, there are these limitations, as I have already mentioned, maybe especially on the security and defense side. So yeah.
Great. Liz or Jo Inge?
Yeah, so I think it's important to look at this shipping in the Northern Sea route in some additional detail. So if we look at Chinese shipping companies, they've been less interested over the last decade, I would say, in that route. And we've seen new shipping companies develop only because they need some company that would not be harmed if subject to sanctions. So that's why we have these new players, and it's not because of greater Chinese interest. And if you look at the direction of the cargo, 95% of it is from Russia to China. And over 60% of that is oil in the so-called shadow fleet that is coming under greater scrutiny. And over 28% is bulk cargo like iron ore, coal, and fertilizer. So China is not really shipping through this route at all because of what Katarzyna said. You don't have on-time shipping because there's still lots of ice around and you can't know when your container is going to get to Europe that way. I would agree, though, that in general in the Arctic they have been expanding. The Coast Guard agreement was very significant. They have agreements with satellite navigation between the Beidou Chinese satellite system and the Russian GLONASS system. They've been engaging in military exercises, as we'll discuss. But I still think that there are some limitations there. There have been a few high-profile espionage cases in Russia targeting Russian scientists who have supposedly collaborated with China against Russian interests, and these were publicized, which I thought was interesting. There was an instance where a Chinese scientific vessel was trying to take some measurements in an area that was just above the Russian zone, and Russia quickly made a claim to that zone. So I think Katarzyna is exactly right about the transpolar route. Russia would not at all be happy if that became navigable, and China could avoid paying Russian icebreaker fees and so on. And I would say that also Russia's looking for other partners, not just China. So India has been one that's been very active in trying to get involved in the Russian Arctic. They are interested in a south-north route to the Russian Arctic via Iran. And Indian company beat out a Chinese company to sell icebreakers to Russia. So India is interested because they're concerned about China monopolizing the Arctic. And then also the UAE has been courted by Russia, to help develop this region as well.
Jo Inge?
Yes, of course, I think as Katarzyna has mentioned a couple of times already, I think it's very important to understand China-Russia in the Arctic within the larger context of China-Russia relations. And this relationship today is quite solid. They have a very strong partnership. And of course, Russia has been willing to welcome China in investments. But there is, if you look at it from the Chinese side, there are Chinese investors are still a little bit reluctant to invest in Russia because it's not the easiest place to do business. Also from the Chinese side, but I sort of my answer to your question, if Russia is willing to collaborate more closely with China in the Arctic, the answer would be yes.
Thank you. All right, let me turn to the military dimension of the Arctic because I know this is one area that the U.S. government's paying a lot of attention to when it comes to Russia and China in the Arctic. So a recent RAND report talked about data and information transmission activities in the Arctic from China and Russia. Their finding was that it does present a risk to the U.S. and other Arctic nations, allows for potentially intelligence collection, military applications, and then potentially threats to critical infrastructure. Now, granted, this is from the U.S. DoD, and that's their perspective, but I did want to ask, when it comes to the military dimension, we have a few questions on this to you all. First is, I mean, just generally speaking, what is your view on the military threat, if any, from both Russia and China as far as what they're doing in the Arctic? And maybe I'll start with Jo Inge first.
Thank you, Lyle. This is, of course, a very, very important topic. I read the RAND report. It's a good report. But when it comes to 5G infrastructures, server farms, satellites, all these dual-use aspects of it, I think it's important to keep in mind that Russia, besides all the other Arctic nations, are NATO members. If you go 5, 6, 7 years back, I would agree that the awareness in Europe about the security dimensions on some of this was less than in the US. But Europe is more aligned with the US view on this today than what was the case 5, 6, 7 years ago. So there is a close collaboration, I would say, between the United States and European NATO members on this particular topic. So some of the investments that China tried to make in the Arctic in these aspects have not materialized due to that close coordination within NATO. But there is a risk element there that one should be concerned and aware of. Also on the military side, we could probably come back to this, but another topic that has been discussed a lot, this is sort of the potential for China positioning their SSBNs in the Arctic Ocean. There's a lot of topics that we perhaps could come back to later.
Katarzyna and Liz?
Well, I don't think that China poses a direct military threat today in its relation to the Arctic, but certainly, if you just consider the Chinese ambition to reshape the existing rules-based order in a way that would, highlights or benefits Chinese interests and values, that creates a fundamental conflict, of course, with Western nations. Of course, the potential direct confrontation in Asia-Pacific, Taiwan would, I think, spill over, of course. And the conflict, this is a conflict that we know China is actively preparing for. And I think science base plays an important role there. We know about China preparing for sabotaging Western infrastructure. So I think indirectly, what China gathers about the region, including scientific activity, it can contribute, it can feed into that major objective goal. Again, we do not see the Chinese submarines today there, although there is some research coming from Germany and from Finland pointing to indicating that China has been investing in submarine technology that is specifically designed for Arctic operations. And if we have Chinese submarines in the Arctic, I think that would make the United States very uneasy. So I think the potential is there. This is something we have to follow. Again, this is not something that is a direct threat today.
Yeah, I would add that another issue that analysts are focusing on is the Chinese investments in ports in Northern Europe. So Nordic countries and the Baltic states have not welcomed these investments, but we do see them in Germany and the Netherlands, for example. And so that's a concern because given the close China-Russia partnership, Russia has an array of coercive tools that it uses for undersea sabotage, and potentially there could be some collaboration between Russia and China that could make use of China's infrastructure investments. And so that's a scenario that some analysts are concerned about.
So picking up on the kind of the military security dimension, there's a debate. We've talked about this idea of the Arctic being a zone of peace and cooperation. We see Russia use that term quite a bit, but there seems to be, at least academically, a debate about what Russia's doing, whether it's actually truly supporting that concept of peace and development in the Arctic. So, Katarzyna, maybe I'll start with you on this. I mean, what is your view on the practical kind of application of that term, and is what Russia's doing in the Arctic supporting that, or maybe kind of undermining that, depending on what aspect of their activity that they're doing?
Yes, I think it's an important aspect of the Russian policies, because yes, on the one hand, you would hear, the big focus on the Arctic in Russia came around 2007 in particular. And since then, they've been talking about the Arctic being a zone of peace and cooperation and territory of dialogue. Foreign Minister Lavrov even said that there are no problems in the Arctic that require use of military means, while at the same time, Russia has been conducting large-scale modernization and military buildup in the Arctic. We talk, of course, about a necessity to modernize the infrastructure along the Arctic coast, which has been neglected since the 1990s. That's a real need and understandable and logical, especially that the Russian threat perception is that one major threat is a potential large-scale earlier attack, this kind of decapitating conventional strike, which may come over the Arctic. So that's where we see, the focus on early warning, on missile defense in the region, radars, etc. But so, on the other hand, Russia has been following the letter of law in the Arctic largely, and because that gains Russia interest. Actually, Russia was engaging in the Arctic cooperation, trying also to use this kind of phrases to portray itself as a reliable stakeholder in the region. But again, at the same time, we had, military buildup, lots of offensive capabilities as well in the region, maybe especially across the border with Norway, where Russia has the major bases. Two-thirds of Russian submarines, strategic submarines, they're located on the Kola Peninsula, just across the border with Norway. That's where, that's second strike capability, very important component. Lots of infrastructure, the launch site in Arkhangelsk where Russia launches intercontinental ballistic missiles, military satellites, anti-satellite weapons, shipyards, etc. So it's a very, very important area, I think. But Russia, you see this kind of two-track two pillars of the Russian cooperation, and sometimes it was very confusing for the Western debates, because some would point, look, Russia is a reliable stakeholder, zone of peace and cooperation, and on the other hand, we had exercises sharply increased since 2007. Some of the exercises were pretty aggressive on a number of occasions, a long list, where Russia would be simulating attacks, including on the Norwegian sites, on the Norwegian headquarters, and radar stations, etc. So this is an apparent contradiction, which was really kind of polarizing the debate. Some would say the Arctic military modernization, Russian military modernization is defensive. Others would say it's offensive. It's both, of course. There is no contradiction in the Russian mind, actually. But if I may, I just add one thing. When we speak about the Russian military presence, you would hear that Russia lost a lot of forces from the Arctic because Russia actually sent a lot of troops from the Arctic brigades, the naval infantry, airborne units to Ukraine. They perished 80%, more than 80% on the front in Ukraine. And that affected the roles of the Northern fleets, the combat capability, maintenance. That being said, the land component is weakened, but the Arctic, has been said today, it's first and most air and maritime domain, and that component is pretty much untouched. So the Northern Fleet, which is still the largest of the Russian four fleets, still is able to conduct its major missions, which is protecting the strategic submarines, its operational area, that's number one, but also capable of attacking critical targets in Europe, the strategic potential, also the strategic lines of communications, NATO naval forces. So this is still a force to be reckoned with. Russia will likely continue modernization. They are struggling on some fronts. However, submarines, they are still quite on time. 3 submarines of the Severodvinsk class are on the way. 3, the newest Gorshkov class frigates are also on the way. So there are priorities that Russia really keeps, and these capabilities are going to reinforce the Russian potential, military potential in the region.
Liz and Jo Inge, do you have anything to add on this?
Well, on the Arctic zone of peace, I would say that this rhetoric, assuming that there should be no conflict in the Arctic, even though, as we just heard, there's a lot of sources of conflict, especially connected to Russian ambitions, that means we have a lack of resources to address conflict, because the Arctic Council itself does not discuss issues of war and peace by its the rules of its development. And the only organizations that discuss issues of conflict are NATO organizations, in which Russia is not involved as recently. So we have really no way to address the conflict issues that do arise, and so that is problematic. And also, we have a lot of global issues in the Arctic that we do need to address that become hostage to the conflicts that exist, like the environmental issues, the indigenous peoples issues. And because of the non-functioning of the Arctic Council, a lot of these issues aren't given the same level of attention. So I think the zone of peace idea, it was a dream of the 1990s, but it doesn't really correspond to the realities. And as a result, we lack effective mechanisms to deal with existing problems.
Yeah, let me pick up on on something Katarzyna said, because that's really important, I think, because it's the importance of the Russian strategic assets on the Kola Peninsula. I think it is in Russia's interest to have stability in the region close to these assets, because it needs to protect them. So that's why I'm also a little bit skeptical towards how willing Moscow is to allow Chinese military presence in the same neighborhood, because that could be destabilizing in also Russia's relationship with the US and with Europe. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. And also if I just have 30 seconds very briefly to say something about because this has been a huge debate in the US about China's interest in positioning their SSBN's strategic nuclear subs in the Arctic Ocean. Of course, we should not rule out this potential, but still I'm a little bit skeptical for a few reasons. And first is that it would not be possible for these Chinese subs to enter the Arctic Ocean unobserved, undetected, because they would need to sail through the Bering Strait. So it means that in order to operate in the Arctic Ocean undetected, they would need to sail from Russian ports, operate out from Russian ports. But even these types of subs, they would also need some type of protection. And I'm not quite sure whether the Chinese would be willing to trust the Russians to protect these subs. I could also add, it makes more sense for China to sail into the Pacific Ocean with these assets rather than sail into the Arctic Ocean. But if this scenario sort of unfolds, it means that China and Russia are working very closely together, and I don't think we are not seeing that for the time.
Thank you. One more question on joint military before we move to kind of scientific marine exploration, and this is to Liz. Liz, you've published quite a bit on joint exercises between China and Russia in the Arctic and in the North Pacific Arctic. As you know, their coast guards are doing a lot more cooperating. So kind of looking at both their Coast Guard and military joint operations, where do you see it going in the future? Do you see this as a function of just their larger strategic alliance and partnership being manifested around the world, and Arctic is just one example, or do you see specific value and purpose to the Arctic in these joint exercises, and do you see it, I guess, increasing, becoming more robust, a wider variety of joint exercises? Kind of, where do you see that going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, the Coast Guard cooperation has some practical purpose, because if there's going to be more shipping along this northern sea route, you need to be prepared for accidents, for rescue missions, oil spills, and so on. So there's that issue. But the Coast Guards of the two countries have very high-level connections. So the Russian Coast Guard is under the FSB, the Security Ministry in Russia, and the Chinese Coast Guard is under the Central Military Commission. So you have a lot of high-level scrutiny of this new cooperation. But I think largely these exercises have a signaling purpose. Especially the ones near Alaska. We've seen Russian and Chinese planes and ships come by Alaska several times in the last few years. And I think this is a kind of payback mission. NATO and U.S. allies are pressuring us. We're going to pressure you. You have an exercise. We're going to have an exercise. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. Even the U.S. Defense Department said that there's not a lot of interoperability that's being gained from these exercises. So not a lot of preparation for mutual military actions, and I think that's because they don't coordinate in general their foreign policies. So why would they need to coordinate their military policies? One thing that does concern me is the series of hybrid actions we have seen in the Baltic area with Russian and Chinese entities involved in cutting undersea cables, and this has happened several times. In one instance, a Chinese ship took responsibility, said it was an accident. And then there was another case just recently. But Chinese merchant ships have been involved in such accidents near the Taiwan Strait repeatedly. And Russia has a unit of its military dedicated to such accidental occurrences. So that I worry that this kind of cooperation is becoming normalized. So I think that the cooperation we do see reflects the geopolitical alignment between Russia and China, but I'm not sure how far it goes to specifics. So whether we're going to see joint actions in the South China Sea or Taiwan, I'm not very sanguine that that's going to happen, because we don't yet have that stage of coordination in the partnership. We do have a lot of effort to display a sense of common purpose, but whether it exists in reality is another question.
Thank you. Okay, let me move to a question on scientific cooperation before opening up to Q&A from the audience. So in the 2000s, China transitioned from having a temporary scientific bases in the Arctic to permanent ones. In 2001, China established its first Arctic research station in Svalbard archipelago between the Norwegian mainland and North Pole. 3 years later, China established the Yellow River Station, which is managed by the Polar Research Institute of China. Since then, China has consistently engaged with Norway through the Yellow River Station laboratories, logging over 1,000 research days in 2019, for example, and resuming sending more scientists there after 2021. And then, in addition to the Yellow River Station, you have the second permanent Arctic research station in Iceland. That opened in 2012, and then 6 years later, China opened at this location what will become known as the China-Iceland Joint Arctic Science Observatory, which hosts China's wet laboratories and workshops. So, question to the group, all three of you on science kind of collaboration. I guess in general, how do you view these two bases as far as the kind of activities it does? Do you think it's going to expand to more bases? And then how does China work with countries like Norway and Iceland for joint collaboration? Is there appetite in Norway and other countries to continue collaboration with China? And where do you see it going? Do you see more scientific bases being opened? Jo Inge, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, again, this is also a topic that has been in the media quite a lot lately, including in U.S. media. Of course, Svalbard is kind of special because China is a signatory to the Svalbard Treaty from 1920 that gives China the right to have a presence there, like Russia has, like the United States has, like a number of countries has. So China opened this research station a couple of decades ago. And back then there was a lot of joint collaboration on research between Norway and China, and also all the Nordic countries. Still some, but less is being more phased out. You have less and less collaboration. I don't really see a willingness on the Norwegian side to expand that kind of cooperation with China. And you see the same trend also in Sweden and Finland, where they are closing down rather than expanding their collaboration with China on these issues. But yeah, so that's one part of it. And also let me add that during the Cold War, the Soviet actually had two communities on Svalbard, and quite large communities back during the Cold War, and less so today. But still, it's so Norway has had a lot of experience dealing with the sensitivity and potential activities of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Norwegian intelligence had and still has a very close collaboration with the U.S. They had that during the Cold War, and that has continued. So I would say there is a pretty decent understanding of what type of activities are taking place.
Katarzyna, and then Liz, same question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think there is there has been a concern that the Chinese research may have dual purpose, dual capability. We know that certainly there has been appetite on the Chinese side to expand their research scientific interests. For instance, they were interested in expanding their space-related activities, build a radar station on Svalbard, which they got no from the Norwegian government. In general, the Norwegian government prohibits research that has military purpose. But there is a concern that still some of the activities may serve, maybe not directly, but some at least indirectly, military purposes, such as missile targeting, tracking satellites, mapping the seabed and ocean. Again, this is not necessarily for a purpose tomorrow, but should there be a major direct confrontation, this potentially can be, such a knowledge can potentially be used in military purposes. So I think this is something that there has been a lot of concern about. This, in general, this accumulated knowledge about the Arctic, seen from a security perspective. I believe that this is something that also receives a lot of attention here in the United States. We know about the one report that was produced by the a congressional committee that is investigating the Chinese Communist Party. It's a bipartisan. There's a bipartisan support for this report. It was very well researched, and there's definitely a concern that China may be using the Arctic for military purposes, science in the region.
I'll just say a few words about the Iceland project. And this was a joint effort to study the Northern Lights by Chinese and Icelandic scientists. And it's an interesting case because the interest came from the local government in Iceland, as well as some former government officials in Iceland who were quite pro-China. But it shows that China is able to exploit differences in views between the more northern localities and then the capitals. And we see this in Iceland and in Norway and in other countries. That's the concern, I think, about Greenland that is now so popular in the United States in terms of would China be able to take advantage of more opportunity to invest in Greenland if Greenland were independent of Denmark, for example. But in the case of this Icelandic station, it has not been finished. It may be bankrupt. So there was a lot of attention to this institute, and people I spoke with in Iceland were very puzzled by all of the attention. And to combat it, they tried to bring in a Japanese partner to make the project more palatable, more international. But it's not clear, what this project is going to lead to.
Great. We have about 13 minutes left. I'd like to open it up now for questions from the audience. If you could please identify yourself and keep your question or comment short. And maybe we can get to about 3 questions. I'll take 3 at once and then open up to the panel for a discussion. So please wait for the mic to arrive. Yes, you.
My name is, hello, is this on?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Daniel Souza. I'm a private individual with an intellectual interest in studying these matters. I have no political or economic financial link, okay? First of all, thank you very much for the terrific insights all of you have provided. That's extremely informative. If one took the narrow view of the Sino-Russian relationship in a narrow sense, it would seem that listening to all the comments that the strategic leverage is very much in favor of Russia having historical, geographic, military, and other reasons, the access being up for China only being through Russia, and China not even being in the Arctic Council, and so on. So in a narrow sense, listening to you, the impression is that it's very much in Russia's favor as far as the leverage is concerned. If one took the broader geopolitical perspective, which has been pointed out by several of you, and let's assume that the Ukraine war is the biggest factor in the broader geographical consideration, then the question I have is, what if we have an early resolution of the Ukraine war and a potential reduction of Russia's dependence on China and North Korea, for that matter? In that scenario, would Russia still be motivated to cooperate with China in the Arctic, seeing that it is possibly using the Arctic as a kind of a carrot for gaining support in Ukraine?
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ben Guggenheim. I'm a associate at Macro Advisory Partners. Kind of on a similar theme with regards to the Ukraine war. Our President Trump has a tendency to seek out grand bargains. What's the potential for something regarding the Arctic to feature in some sort of discussion over the end of the war in Ukraine? And what are European and Chinese fears along that line? There's been a lot of talk recently of a reverse Kissinger sort of move to break China from Russia. Like, what fears kind of exist regarding that grand bargain.
Anyone else?
I'm interested to hear your response to their questions. Recently, we've also seen, my name is Robin Wood-Saylor. I'm a venture partner with Helena Capital. Recently, we've seen some sabotage of undersea cables. And I'm wondering, what that represents. Is it part of a greater strategy? And what your thoughts are on its demonstration?
Okay. We got 3 questions. We got about 9 minutes left. I got first, early resolution of the Ukraine war. What would Russia still want to cooperate with China in the Arctic? Second, on a grand bargain with Trump and what that means for the region. And then third, the undersea cable issue. So,
I can start with the first question.
sure.
So yeah, I think lots of discussion about whether the dependence of Russia on China would weaken if we get a resolution. But I'm not sure if it's that simple because, well, first of all, there is a lot of interest that actually keep these countries together. Lots of course, contradicting interests, etc. We talked about. However, there are some in place. They are not going to go away. And another thing is that Russia has switched a lot of or built a sort of war economy or militarized economy. There is still a discussion about it, but large parts of the economy actually switch into the war effort. And China plays a role of filling the other spaces. This is not going to change as quickly, I think. Also because if you look at the Russian plans, so in December 2022, they started with a large-scale reform in the military, which based also on the experiences from Ukraine, which expands or intend to expand the defense organization hugely. So on the paper, they have already expanded it 3 times, 1.5 million standing army. The whole military organization is, the objective is to increase to 2.4 million people. Big plans about, of course, they have already started changing the command structure. So I do not really see the war economy switching very quickly back to the civilian one. And so I still see the role of China. We will have to see, of course, how it will play out, but the ambitions, for medium and long term in Russia is to continue the war effort and expand significantly the armed forces, basically prepare for a potential direct confrontation, large-scale conflict. So unfortunately, I don't see it as optimistically.
Yeah, I think if we look back at the history, Russia became interested in engaging with China in the Arctic in 2013. Those were the first energy investments that China was able to make in that area. So this was before the first invasion of Ukraine. The Russian interest is not only connected to Ukraine. It has to do with finding a way to engage with China economically, which was difficult in Russia. There weren't that many areas where they were compatible as partners, but the Arctic is one of them. And it also fulfills a goal of trying to stimulate some cooperation between the eastern part of Russia, the Russian Far East, and the Chinese Northeast. And that's also been a weak point in their cooperation. And that's important because those are the regions that share the long border. And so I don't see the resolution of the war in Ukraine changing this. Russia might have more amenable partners. Sanctions might impede their cooperation less, but I think the general trend was set well before the Ukraine war.
Yeah, very good point. Totally agree. Very quick on each of the 3 questions. I agree with Elizabeth. China, Russia, and the Arctic is not related to the war in Ukraine, but you very good observation that sort of overall Russia is the junior partner of China in global affairs, right? But in the Arctic, it's the opposite. In the Arctic, Russia is the great power vis-a-vis China, right? So that's the place where they actually have some leverage. That's a very good observation. When it comes to Nixon reversed, There is a different dynamic today. It's not possible to do an exact copy of the 1971 deal. Because if you look at the situation back in the late 60s and in 1971, China was weak. China was in war with the Soviet Union. They had a rift concerning ideology. The Soviet Union was able to encircle China. That was the background for China and US aligning. Today the situation is very, very different. Even though the US and Russia are able to make a deal today, Russia would still be a good partner of China. Right? So it wouldn't change the China-Russia dynamic in any profound ways, I think. So it's very important to see the differences here. On undersea cables, I think this, I don't know, but I think this is pretty much about sort of both China and Russia showing that if we want, we can hurt you.
Anything, Liz? On that?
Yeah, and the reverse Nixon, I also am not a fan of this idea, and Jo Inge explained the historical differences very well. But I think it would be a bad bargain also, because Russia is in the process of nationalizing private enterprises. The US companies lost a lot of money already in the earlier rounds of nationalizations, and I don't know why we would believe that, as if Katarzyna is correct with this military buildup that's going on, this is not going to be a conflict-free area in the future, regardless of what bad bargains people might be inclined to force on Ukraine. I think that it would be a very risky business move for American businesses, and unnecessary, since we're a competitor for LNG with Russia. Why would we be investing there to begin with? And I also agree that the Russia-China relationship is not going anywhere. It's a deep-seated relationship that has a political underpinning, and it's not just reacting to the geopolitics of the moment. They have a very long border they need to keep stable. They have had interactions since the 17th century, and they're committed to making this partnership work. So various maneuvers are not going to unseat that. I mean, there are reasons within the partnership that might lead to problems in the future, but there's nothing that we can influence.
I agree on the reverse Kissinger. I think that I just would add to what already has been said, that these both countries are, of course, very well aware how big leverage it is, the fear that has now several decades old of the fear of the Sino-Russian alliance. I don't think they will give it away so easily. That's one thing. And when it comes to just the last thing about the critical infrastructure, it's really, I think the Chinese involvement is puzzling to me, because we know that both countries develop this kind of capabilities to be able to attack critical infrastructure. It makes sense, in a time of war. That's exactly the first. You want to attack the very foundation of how the states are functioning, and the military, but also the state. So we know, of course, Russia has huge capabilities. They developed it for decades. The main director for deep sea research has been very active. It's also, by the way, located in the high north, and mostly they have some capabilities in the Baltic, but mostly with the Northern Fleet. So we have, with the Navy in the high north, and very much developed capability. So I think, if anything, I would probably agree that this is a kind of statement that just a show of signaling, perhaps, effect of showing what kind of capability we have and what we can potentially do. So better do a deal with us. So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So please join me in thanking the panel for excellent discussion.